Okay, so for our demonstration of knitting the herringbone in the round, I've put some stitches on this little mini hoop. If you were knitting this in reality, you could use an odd or even number of stitches. And in the previous video, Herringbone Cowl pattern suggestions, all those patterns will, the numbers of the stitches and the rod size will be in the body of my explanatory area. So I cast on all of those, other than the one that I did a cable cast on. I just did a long tail cast on, and it was just, as you've seen me do a number of times. Here's my tail, and I bring it around my thumb, and then use this portion around the knitting hoop, wrap the working yarn, bring the loop back over, and there's a stitch. Now, you need to join it in the round. You want to bring your working yarn to the front, and you could just bring your tail back through the back, and be sure you have a sticky mat. And before you begin, so I've cast onto this smaller size. Now I want to go ahead and I'm going to first take my first stitch over here to join it in the round. But before I put my stitch marker over here, so I'm going to knit this with the last stitch or basically the first stitch I cast on. So the last stitch I cast on comes over to here. It's going to get knit with this, but before I do, I'm going to go ahead and put a rubber band around the end of this. We'll see if I can get my cap on. I think I got my rubber band a little too big, and now squeeze your cap on there. You might not be able to get it to go down all the way initially because your stitches are there, and you don't want to shove them off. So if you have to, leave your cap kind of sticking up until you've knit some of those stitches, because now you're going to make your first stitch. So just go ahead and hold your working yarn across your left index finger, and the first stitch is the one that you cast on last, and just put it down over the working yarn like so. And then this is the first stitch you cast on, put it on top. So now you have two stitches here and you're knitting them together. You're going to take the working yarn, pull it through, and place it on top of the cap like so. Now you have two stitches around your working yarn, and you want to take the top stitch and place your finger with the working yarn under it again. You're going to re-knit that with the next stitch you take off. So now you're knitting these two together, and now you're piping the new stitch. You're basically dropping or ignoring the stitch you've already knit twice, and you're going to pick up the stitch you removed last from this side and knit that again. So the working yarn, if you can imagine separating these two, and then placing your finger in the working yarn up under the stitch again. Take the next stitch off. Oops, no, just push these around. Sorry. So take your working yarn, push it up through the stitch, take the next stitch off, and knit those two together. Place the new stitch on the pipe, and the entire row is knit two together. In a knitting pattern, it will read knit two together, taking only the first stitch off. In our case, we're taking them both off, but we're picking up the second stitch again. It comes out to the same thing. Now, once you've knit several stitches and you're working your stitches around, you should be able to push your cap farther down. The finger goes up with the working yarn up under the top stitch. Stitch comes off. So try not to split the plies when you're pulling those through. And then eventually you'll be able to push the cap so it's flush. If you have vinyl tubing that fits it snugly, you won't need to plug the end. Or if it fits tight enough, you probably don't need to plug the end. I didn't originally have a rubber band on there, but I kept picking it up from the wrong end by the cap and then losing the stitches. And you're going to do the entire row the same way. We'll work our way around. Every time, you're basically knitting each stitch twice, and that's why this pattern uses a lot of yarn. And one of the reasons the edges curl, because there's more yarn in the back than there's in the front, I think. Now, as you're working your stitches around, these are going to be much looser because they've been formed on this larger pipe. So be careful you don't push them all the way off the end. Now look, I see I did something. I forgot to put my stitch marker on. So I'll show you what we do when we get there. I do that all the time. You want to put your stitch marker on before you make that first stitch. Each time you're just taking the top stitch, putting the working yarn back under it, taking another stitch off, knitting those two together. And we'll make one more. And we'll put our stitch marker on since we forgot. Now, you can put this on any way you want to. You can tie it in a, as long as it's going to stay. Now, you're going to make one more that is knit two together. Now, we are now going to change for the second row and do knit two together through the back loop. And what you want to do is take the last stitch that came off, which is the top one, and put it on your right finger, and take off the next stitch and add it to your index finger. Put it on so that, you know, if you were to look at it this way, it would look like the V of a knit stitch. Basically put it on like your finger like that. And then you're going to take your working yarn in your left hand and just push it through. If you want to have your fingers meet, which is a good way of guiding it in a hole when it's small. And there's your working yarn. Pipe it. Pick up, again, the second of the two stitches, the one closest to the old stitches. Take off another stitch and knit those two together through the back loop. Now these are going to be fairly loose because the stitches were formed on the US 35 size. So be careful when you push them around, and be careful they don't cross up. So it's always taking this next stitch. Now notice the stitches are now side by side rather than stacked as they were in the knit two together row. And this is the row that if on the smaller tubing that's difficult if you have wrist issues. So if you're having any trouble like that, all you need to do is take a crochet hook and you come in through the second stitch just like it were your finger, right to left, take off a stitch, place it on there with that one. So now you have two stitches on the crochet hook. And now take your working yarn and just loop it over the top of your crochet hook and pull the loop of working yarn through. You can either pipe it just like that, or you can use your finger, but you want to make sure that it's facing the right direction when you push it down or drop it onto your pipe. I'll show you that again. So the crochet hook comes in through this. Make sure you have the back stitch. Notice how this one's already been knit twice. This is the one you want to knit again. So you're coming in right to left. You can either use the crochet hook to pick up the next stitch, which I sometimes do too. I did on that, the one I started on the 15, the smaller hoop. and loop your working yarn over, bring it through, and pipe it. And that's how you can do a crochet hook. So let's whip around, and that's how you would go around the entire thing. Just like so. Again, don't push those too fast. If you have a lot of stitches on here, a 16-inch long hoop will be plenty for a normal cowl, but if you want it wider, you may want a 24-inch long hoop. Get my finger to work there. In there. Make sure you have plenty of slack on your ball of yarn. Okay, you have one more stitch. So you're knitting those two together now through the back loop. Pipe it. Now take your stitch marker, move it over here. You're going to do one more through the back loop. So pick up your stitch, take a stitch off, knit those together. So you should have one more that was the previous, what you've been doing the whole row above your stitch marker. Now you're going to switch back to the knit two together. You want to re-knit the second stitch, the one you took off last, and that's this stitch. And all you need to do is place your finger up under the working yarn. This is the second stitch you took off, the last stitch. Now you're going to knit it with this next stitch. And that's all you need to do between the row when you're going from knit through the back loop to the knit two together. And then you're doing the same thing again. Notice that immediately once I've done that, those stitches are now stacked on top of one another. If you forget where you are, if you don't put this down and walk away from it at the change. It's easier if you stop in the middle of a row, because all you have to do is look. And if I look back at these stitches from, is that okay right here? Mm-hmm. If I look back at this row, this is the one I just knit, here's my new stitches. I see that all these bars are leaning back. I know that I knit those together through the back loop. If they're leaning the other direction, I know that they were knit through the front loop. Now we're going to switch to, and you'll do that every row. Each row alternates from knitting two together to knitting two together through the back loop. Now, I'm almost done with this. It may be too narrow, and I'll know that for sure once I'm totally finished. And you can see how and that's about how it comes out. I should have pulled those a little bit snugger, but basically that is something you won't be able to see. I put 80 stitches on here. You can see this is the US 15, and my little cap is just a piece of polyethylene tubing that barely fit on there. I had to put a slit down it to get it, so I'll be able to get it off. Hopefully I can get it off. And it's not real wide. It might not be wide enough. I thought 80 stitches would do it, but remember, it's going to stretch. Yeah, it's maybe only 20. But I'll put my directions in and you'll know if 80 stitches was. I'll put my recommendation for what proper size is, but mostly I wanted you to see this. So here I am. I have one stitch left. I look and I go, aha, see, I know that this was a knit two together row because my little bars, if you can tell that, lean back the whole row. And that's the way it should look. And I have one stitch left with the knit two together, and you can see how very tiny these are. You kind of got to pull them out a little bit and put my finger up and take the stitch off. One more. Now this row is complete, and what I'm going to do is for the last two rows I'm going to take my cap off. And hopefully it's going to slide right off of there, because this is the one I had to slice to get on there in the first place. So I'm twisting it, if you can tell that. Come on. Okay, so you can see I just made that with some polyethylene tubing. Might be able to do it with straws if you had straws that were big enough. But I just took my razor knife, made a slit down it so I could get it off like that. So now, kind of scrunched it up. Put your stitch marker over there. You don't really need to count rows. What you want is depth. And I have about 10 inches. And so, and I would prefer to cast off on the knit two together. But I want these last two rows to be on the smaller pipe because it'll firm it up a little bit, makes the whole thing look nicer. Just like we did on the rug, how the ends of the rug wanted to spooge out. Well, the same thing happens on the scarf. So that's why the first and the last two rows have to be on the smaller pipe. And now that I've done that, I can go back to my knit two together through the back loop. Now this is difficult on this one because this is so tiny. And so notice how this is my stitch I have to start with. It's the top one. So when you go from the knit two together round to the knit two through the back loop, you know, it's going to be the top stitch. If you get confused and you're not sure, do this. Take off your stitch marker and just take your yarn and pull it back out of those last two stitches. And you say, aha, this was the last stitch I knit. Okay? Put it back up, and you know, you'll need to redo that stitch. But that way you can identify what that was. Make sure that that indeed was the last stitch in case you're a little confused, because that was a confusing part of this. Otherwise, this pattern is extremely easy. So now pick up this last stitch, and you won't be able to get your whole finger in there even. Just the little tip will be enough. Take off the next stitch. Those are the two you're going to knit together. Now look how small that hole is once I've turned that. But you can manage. If you have any difficulty, use the crochet hook as I showed you before. And you'll see how small this is. And you see how this ply separates. It's a little tricky to use. And you will do that entire row as knit two together through the back loop. And then you'll do one more row casting off with your knit two together row. And that's how you knit herringbone in the round. Enjoy your beautiful scarves. Thanks for watching.